Okay, let's dive right into what is honestly an incredible digital mystery. It's May 2022. Europe's entire geopolitical architecture is shifting literally overnight. You've got two very similar nations, Sweden and Finland, facing the exact same geopolitical crisis. They're simultaneously abandoning decades, and for Sweden actually centuries, of military non-alignment to apply for NATO membership. They announced it together, they submitted their letters together, and when things stalled because of diplomatic objections from Turkey, their citizens jumped onto the exact same platform, Twitter, which we now call X, to debate the whole shebang. But here is the wild part. Despite dealing with the identical crisis on the identical algorithm, these two nations behaved completely differently online. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a huge myth, what academics call technological determinism. We constantly hear that algorithms just force us into these toxic, polarized shouting matches, right? Like we have no choice. But what if that's only half the story? We're going to explore a really fascinating natural experiment that proves it's actually our offline culture, not just the algorithms, that fundamentally scripts our digital world. The data really illustrates this starting point perfectly. For years, the conversation about Turkey in both Sweden and Finland was basically just a flatline, nothing much happening. And then boom, early 2022 hits and we see this massive, synchronized explosion of online activity erupting in both nations, all triggered by that NATO application crisis. It's literally the exact same external shock hitting both publics at the exact same millisecond. So, to solve exactly why these two publics reacted so differently to that same shock, we're turning to a seriously remarkable piece of research. This explainer is built entirely on the core findings of a brilliant solo-authored paper. Yeah, researched and written by just a single academic, Selcan Öztürk, who realized this moment was an incredibly rare natural experiment in political communication. The methodology here was incredibly meticulous. The researcher mined the Nordic tweet stream, strictly using geolocated data from January 2022 to May 2023. That way we know these users were actually physically in Sweden and Finland. They targeted native keywords, Turkeyit and Sweden and Turkey and Finland. Now here's a really fun methodological quirk. The Finnish word Turkey actually means both Turkey the country and fur, like animal fur. So to make sure the data was purely geopolitical, the researcher had to build this hilarious filter to strip out words like dog, cat, and warm. Otherwise, they'd accidentally be analyzing Finnish citizens chatting about buying winter coats for their pets. All right, so our first major clue is a structural one. In Sweden, the digital discourse was completely captured by a tiny, hyperactive minority. Just to put this in perspective, a staggering 34.1% of the entire national conversation on this diplomatic crisis was generated by just the top 1% of users. We're talking about a mere 29 people generating over a third of the whole nation's geopolitical discourse. Finland, on the flip side, had a way more resilient distributed structure, with their top 1% generating only about 20% of the volume. What this creates is a massive, intense hockey stick inequality in the data. In Sweden, this winner-takes-all structure emerged, where a tiny fraction of users grabbed a massive share of the tweets. Finland, meanwhile, maintained a much smoother, egalitarian distribution. Basically, the conversation was shared across a much broader coalition of regular folks, rather than being completely hijacked by a few massive megaphones. And that structural inequality led directly to huge behavioral differences, what we can call a massive shouting versus talking gap. Swedish users were broadcasting with high volume, but getting incredibly low interactions. They barely used hashtags to coordinate, and they really didn't tag other users much. They were basically just shouting into the void. Finnish users, though, utilized hashtags to actually organize shared topics and used app mentions at a way higher rate to talk to one another. They used the platform to coordinate and deliberate, not just to broadcast. You can see exactly how this plays out when we look at the prime suspects controlling these narratives. At the very top of Sweden's network, you find accounts like Ove Tollers, who pumped out nearly 1,800 tweets in this period. This is classic spam activist behavior, someone with a small organic following relying on sheer, repetitive volume to just force their message into visibility. Finland's apex, however, was anchored by users like Alan Salazada. He's an established expert with over 7,000 followers, but he only tweeted 30 times, and yet he had massive organic reach. So one sphere is completely driven by raw volume, the other is driven by expertise. We even see this contrast directly in the content of their posts. The top Swedish accounts relied heavily on repetitive, adversarial attacks against domestic politicians, stuff like demanding the prime minister resign immediately. It was highly personalized and super urgent. The top Finnish accounts, meanwhile, were offering analytical,
Historical context. They were calmly discussing 70-year-old alliance structures without taking any partisan sides at all.
Now here's where it gets really wild. A supplementary analysis showed that both the Swedish and Finnish publics actually totally agreed on the core issue. Anti-NATO sentiment was virtually non-existent in both datasets. They both wanted to join the alliance. Yet, despite entirely agreeing on the end goal, the Swedish digital sphere was just saturated with adversarial blame framing. Nearly a quarter of all their tweets were just attacking named politicians and pointing fingers over the stalled application.
By total contrast, Finland's digital sphere was remarkably disciplined. A tiny 2.1% of their conversation involved adversarial blame. Instead, they heavily favored analytical and informational framing. Over 30% of their discourse was dedicated to geopolitical analysis and strategic reasoning. Think about that for a second. They were using the exact same platform to discuss the exact same geopolitical roadblock, holding the exact same pro-NATO stance, yet they were communicating in completely different universes.
Which perfectly sets up the resolution to our mystery and introduces a really powerful concept from the source paper, the cultural filter. Think of the cultural filter as a mediator. It's the idea that our broad societal norms actually translate into patterned ways of communicating. And those cultural patterns can absolutely override the default settings and algorithms of whatever platforms we happen to be using.
It basically works like a giant funnel. You have the platform affordances, like Twitter's built-in drive for virality and visibility. But before those tech tools result in actual human action, they pass through the cultural filter of a specific nation. So it's not the algorithm dictating behavior. It's the national political culture acting as a lens for how those digital tools are actually used by the people on the ground.
So what exactly were those different cultures? Well, in Sweden, the NATO decision reversed literally centuries of neutrality, which caused deep domestic partisan fractures. You combine that with a highly active diasporic civil society, and this underlying conflict culture turned the platform into a broadcast oligarchy where activists just shouted for visibility. Finland, however, has a history completely shaped by its proximity to Russia. They have a deeply ingrained consensus culture regarding national security. They expect absolute unity and defer heavily to security elites. That cultural expectation is what created a resilient communicative mesh network online. Ultimately, this explainer proves a super vital point for our modern age. Digital polarization is absolutely not an inevitable technological destiny. Sure, social media platforms provide the architecture, the buttons, the algorithms, the feeds, but it is our offline culture that scripts the interaction. A platform doesn't magically force a society to tear itself apart, especially if that society's offline culture values consensus and deliberation. Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought to ponder as you log back on today. If it's true that culture truly scripts our digital interactions and that algorithms are merely amplifying what we already value deep down, take a long, hard look at your own social media feed. What does your timeline say about your society?